Okay, great. So here I am. So welcome everyone to the next in the series of the NAEA Museum Education Division peer-to-peer hangout series. So we are in our part 2 of our reading series, and today we are talking about this book, Teaching the Museum, Careers in Museum Education. And my name is Michelle Grohe, and I am on the development committee for the museum education, which is part of the leadership arm of the museum education division. And I'm joined with my colleague Julene Chevalier, who's joining in from the Nasher down in North Carolina. And I'm from the Gardner Museum here in Boston, Massachusetts. So Julene and I will be talking about the book and some questions or topics that have come up for us throughout it. And then we also will invite all of you to chime in, share your thoughts, and ask any questions as we go along. And that's basically the format. So it's a very open-ended discussion where we're just thinking about pausing and taking some time throughout the summer to, which can be difficult for some of us, to slow down and spend some time reading those books that pile up in on our desks or at home, and just think about it and talk about it peer-to-peer. So with that being said, we're just going to start talking for a little bit.
And I also wanted to give a shout out to Emily Holtrop, who is the division president-elect, and I got the reading day idea from her. She occasionally gets her staff together, and they all just focus on reading, and so I shamelessly borrowed the idea and try to get my staff to do it once a month, and we put it on the calendar and we do it, and we get out of the museum, which is really important. We go someplace, we all read the same thing in the morning, whether it's an article, a chapter, whatever, and then we talk about it, and then in the afternoon we all read our individual things and then can chat and compare notes in the afternoon. So it's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it, and it is a good use of your time.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. So let's see. Do you, Julie, do you actually just want to talk for a minute or two about the leadership conference that you just attended for NAEA, and I'll see if I can get the. So as we're going along, feel free to type in questions or answers or comments in the chat, the Q&A box below the video that's projecting right now. And if you do that, I can see if I can get that to pull up on your and my screen while you're talking.
Awesome.
Okay, great.
Great. So, as folks may or may not know, and I didn't know this before I got into a higher leadership position within the state, I'm actually the current president of the North Carolina Art Education Association. And every summer, your regional, the presidents of your state gather in their regional groups, and they meet to discuss position statements and other exciting things. And this year, the NAEA decided to do a nationwide leadership retreat, so it was replacing those regional meetings. So it was open to anybody, actually. They had an early enrollment for presidents, presidents-elect, etc. But then it was open to anybody. And so it was 150 members of NAEA. Out of those, there were 4 museum educators. We're often underrepresented, but we were still there in a few numbers. And it was a really amazing few days in Santa Fe where we talked about leadership styles, about every art educator is a leader, how every leader is an artist. We had a lot of time to discuss our leadership styles. We did a DISC assessment to figure out what your personal preference is for communication, etc., and how people can sometimes perceive you and what you can do to help ameliorate some problems that come up. I like to make decisions too quickly, and sometimes people can feel like they have not been heard or like I'm dismissing their ideas, so I have to learn to listen more, which is a good thing for me to remind myself of. And it was just a really great, we had some great speakers, blah, 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 and I've got my little notebook in front of me. And, you know, there's so many different kinds of ideas about leadership. I think a lot of the message was being, sorry, I've got a little pop-up coming up. Part of the message was, especially for teachers, that you can be a change agent in your school. As the art teacher, you often are kind of sidelined or not seen as important, and occasionally museum educators can feel the same way within a larger museum structure. Hopefully it's changing, but some days it does and some days it doesn't. And so there's so many different things. One thing I'm looking at right now is the idea of being a kind boss, which I think we all hope to have kind bosses or be kind bosses. And so thinking about compassion, integrity, gratitude, authenticity, humility, and humor. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, as many of us work with docents and volunteers of various kinds, there was a leader who described treating his employees, his staff, as if they were volunteers. So showing them the same appreciation and gratitude and support and things like that. So that's a great thing to keep in mind. Exhausting, but a good thing to keep in mind. I don't want to ramble on forever. Let's see. Michelle, do you want to jump in with anything?
No, I think it was, it's just interesting where NAEA is putting in these resources to think about how the membership wants to think about leadership, and also thinking about ways to provide opportunities for members in interesting and new ways. So I found that aspect interesting, that there's this national convention that sounds like it'll become an annual opportunity where members can do that.
Exactly. If not annual, then every other year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so folks who are listening should keep their eyes open for it. It's, believe it's about $200 registration, and then, typical $200 a night hotel, and they feed you a lot. You didn't have to buy a lot of your own stuff, and it was in beautiful Santa Fe, where I think that they want to try and do it from now on, I think, because there was such a positive response there. So I highly recommend it. Really nice opportunity. And of course, a big focus on communication, making sure you're understood. And I think as museum educators, we're tuned into knowing our audience and changing our styles of communication to address those differences.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Great. So I thought I would, let me just switch the camera here. So I thought I'd talk for just a little bit about why we chose this particular book, and then kind of dive in a little bit about some of the questions that came up when we were talking about it. So, and we were hoping to have the editor, Leah Melber, join us, but she had a conflict at the last minute, so maybe we could ask her some questions afterwards. But just this idea of how we provide mentorship or advice to folks that are looking to enter the field, and then also how do we sustain or maintain our interest in our work, and how do we further what we're learning and grow in our careers as well as our work. And the interesting thing about teaching the museum and in that book is it really, rather than it being one of the things that struck me right away was, rather than being a manual in terms of this is how you go about doing working with docents, or how you problem solve through certain things, or how you design public programs. It was more this candid type of essays where different museum educators from a variety of different types of museums were just talking about how they joined the field, some really big lessons learned along the way, both positive as well as painful, and how that can serve us in developing our work. But then also thinking about when obstacles come up, how we go about overcoming them, and then also ways that we should start thinking about how we can continue to nurture our own development and see how that grows along the way. So, and I know that in one of the introductory essays, Leah was talking about how she really wanted it to be something where if someone were to approach you and just ask you for some advice or some insight, it was more like a casual conversation rather than something that was more instructive. So, and the great thing about the book, too, is that it provides a balance of those that are kind of just entering the field and kind of figuring it out, and those mid-level, and then those that have been in the field for quite a while. And you have this whole range of thinking about what was it like when you first entered the field, and a lot of the writers were mentioning that there's this huge pressure that we place mostly on ourselves, but as well as what you think others expect of you, where you have to pick up every piece of literature, every article, or connect with a lot of people to learn as much as you can and figure it all out. And what a lot of the mid to more experienced level educators said that over time they started realizing it's not necessary to know everything, but it is important to listen and communicate really well with your coworkers as well as your audiences, and gently start figuring out, like, what am I really good at? What do I need to work on? Are there things that I never will be good at? And that's okay. So just thinking a little bit more practically about the inner workings of how you go about joining the field and working, and how we go about our jobs. So it's a great resource just for that, because it's a way to kind of almost pick 20 plus professionals' brains and get their insights into what that journey was like, which I thought was really interesting.
That made me think of, and for everybody watching out there, we're doing this very free form, so bear with us, it's an experiment. That just made me think about the idea, thinking about entry level, and one of the main things that I saw repeated was how difficult it is to enter the field these days. I feel very fortunate that I graduated college and grad school at a time when there were lots of jobs in general. I don't know about museum jobs specifically, but the economy was better than it is now. And I don't know what you're hearing from folks that intern with you, Michelle, or other young professionals in the field about what is helping them break into the field. How do they get noticed? What are the things that set them apart? Or if you've done any hiring recently, what jumps out at you in that process?
Yeah, actually, we just hired a CRESS interpretive fellow who is, so the CRESS Foundation offers interpretive fellowships to museums that they can apply for to host someone for up to 1 calendar year. It's up to the providing institution, and basically it's a way to provide this a fantastic entry-level position for someone who's interested in learning more about museum education, or how museum and curatorial can work together. And we just went through that hiring process, and the person that we ended up selecting, the big reason, so we were talking about this a little bit yesterday in preparation, like what questions do we ask prospective employees, and a big one that I love to ask is just, how does this position, if you were to get this position, how would it help you fulfill your goals that you have for yourself professionally and personally for the next 5 years, or where do you see yourself in 5 years? And it's really interesting because that question usually gives us a sense of, is this person thinking in that term, like, how is this going to help me, or are they thinking, I just really need a job and this is something that fits that cue? It also starts to give us a sense of why the person or the candidate is interested in the field of museum education, and particularly working in our institution. And the person we hired was fantastic. She took it a little bit to the extreme, where she laid it out year by year, what was about to happen for her, which I loved. And I wrote it down and saved it. So when she's 5 years from now, I'm going to check in with her and see how far along she is. But then there are others that are like, oh, I don't know, I haven't really thought about that. That's a really good question. And that, it's fine if you haven't thought about it before, but it's good if you think of, how are you, if you are asked something that you aren't expected, which I think most of us have that situation in a job interview. It's good to just start thinking, like, okay, I have to say something or mention something, or can I get back to you or write you an email in an hour or two or tomorrow? And so that really stood out. And then I also am really drawn to working with others that, even if they have no experience, which I think, like, my first job in an art museum, I had only had a short-term internship at 2 other museums before that. And so my first employer took a really big chance on me, and I think that I'm open to that as well, but the individual needs to be really clear about what it is they're hoping to gain from that position, and be really clear about, I think it helps to be honest with what you're like these are my strengths and I think they would apply because of what I understand about your museum or museum education. But then also acknowledging like I don't know X, Y, and Z, and I'm hoping that given your, your great reputation or knowing what your work is here, I'm hoping that I can fill out that part of my resume. So, like at the Gardner, I hadn't done too much, very many public speaking engagements, and that was a huge component. We were doing a big research project, and I was expected to present like within the first month after I got there. So it was really clear about like, okay, like I need to get really comfortable with this pretty quickly, or I'm just going to learn along the way, which I did. But it's just helpful to acknowledge like I've done X amount of speaking, but I think I'm like we're going to see how well I do this. And
well,
it's
that seems like
yeah.
an example of yes and figure it out later, right?
Exactly. Yeah, there's a great chapter there where it's like, there's a great checklist that Leah Melber wrote where she was saying like, is this something you can do and how will it help you in the future? And is it something are you biting off more than you can chew type of thing? So I don't know. So I think that especially for entry level, like when you're joining the field, it's not necessary for me for you to have prior museum education experience because that's why someone's first coming into the field. But what is your interest? Why are you interested in working with us or doing this type of work? So having, I don't know, or someone who's just even aware of like what's going on in the museum education
Yeah,
world right now.
I agree. I mean, one thing that I look for in a cover letter or in a message of any kind is that passion, right? It's like
Mhm.
I wanna hear that you love art and want to share it with people. It's like, well, that's why we all are doing it, but I want to hear that explicitly from you, and like you be so excited that you have to tell me that. I mean, it shouldn't be the overexuberance of like a college application, a college essay, which sometimes get a little effervescent, but
Right.
and over the top. But yeah, I want to see that, and of course, you want to know how this position is going to fit in their plans and their goals, but also bringing it back to what your skills are that can help the institution and the department. And I think that it's tough these days. Again, in the reading, there's this idea that previous non-museum experience can be a great influence and inspiration and help you think about things differently. So keeping that in mind, like, oh, well, I have a background in engineering, so I'll be able to create all sorts of exciting STEAM programs, and really playing up those strengths in any experience that may not be museum related.
Sure. Um, and I guess that kind of leads me to also this question of also there were a lot of folks that were mentioning here I am and I took a big risk and this didn't really work, or I thought I knew what I was doing, and so like these epic failures and what you learned along the way. Um, and I wasn't sure if any came to mind for you when we were talking about that. Not to put you on the spot,
No,
Julie,
that's
but
okay. Actually, a few years ago in the Fort Worth conference, I hosted a session called "Fabulous Failures in Museum Education." So
that's right. I enjoyed that session. That was good. Yeah.
so I wholeheartedly agree in learning from our mistakes. And my failure was when we had volunteer docents rolling out a self-evaluation form that was totally top down. I had developed it and thought that they would all love it, and it's this chance to be thoughtful and reflective, and they all hated it because they thought they were asking me to grade themselves and that they were going to be really hard on themselves, and the people that were already good were going to be too self-critical, and the people that really needed the help weren't going to be able to actually actively self-reflect and accurately self-reflect. So we scrapped it and started again with input from the docents. And that's pretty, that's kind of 101 of get input from your audience of how they want to participate in something, especially as sensitive as evaluation, even if it's self-evaluation. So I clearly was just gung-ho and too the museum was brand new and raring to go, but you have to remember to stop and get buy-in from your audience, especially docents.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. So it's like those painful lessons that a lot of the authors were describing, that uncomfortable in this pit of your stomach feeling of like, oh no, like you can feel that it's not working and something's, and then again it's like I got to think outside the box or be flexible with how I think about this right now and just keep plugging along, but also taking that time to pause and reflect, okay, what just happened? What did I think was going to happen, and how can I prevent this particular circumstance from happening
Yeah,
in the
and
future?
I'm a big believer in taking risks, and I feel like it's so taboo in our society and our culture. I think especially the museum culture, it's like we have to do a program and it has to be fabulous right out of the gate and have high attendance. And I don't think that's a reasonable expectation always. And I think it's good to do things that are quirky and experimental and, take calculated risks, but take risks. And also, you know, have an environment. I hope I cultivate an environment in my department that it's okay to say, "Oh, I messed up, and yeah, this is what I've learned and can take from it." I don't. Maybe I'm unusual in this respect, but I don't hesitate to say like, "Yeah, I screwed up. I did that wrong," and it's not a bit like, "Yeah, it's wrong, but I'm not going to do it that same way again," and it's not the end of the world that whatever that was is wrong. Um,
Right.
so encouraging people to not be terrified of taking a little risk now and then.
No, sure. Like you don't know until you try, and often when you take those risks, that's where a lot of the creativity or innovation can happen, or just thinking about things from a different perspective can help you maybe perhaps reshape or develop new programs along the way. So yeah, it's definitely um,
How about you? Do you have a facepalm moment?
I had one when we were talking last night, and now I can't remember what um, I think for me. I learned just through different experiences about um, actually going back to the interviewing process and certain questions that I probably should have asked along the way through that process and didn't, and realized that a couple of times the intern that we hired wasn't necessarily the best fit. So just thinking about, okay, what are some things that we can then reshape what the internship expectations are and what we expect from the intern, and then what they expect to learn from us. And then sometimes there's the intern breakup where you just have to end things early, or something else happens where it's just not working out. And I think that um, especially like the Gardner is known with our school programs for using VTS, and I think that a lot of young, or I should say new to the field folks, have certain expectations just from articles that they're reading or listening to how we describe it. And then when you actually go about teaching or leading those lessons and understanding that there's a certain structure to it, it's just really not, most of the folks that we're working with in terms of audience are beginner viewers. And when someone who's really excited about art history and wants to share what they know realizes that this isn't necessarily the type of program where we do that, even though we're really clear up front that that's how we teach, I think there's just this notion of this is what I have certain ideas or expectations are there about what people should learn. And I think that it's been really, I wouldn't say painful, but I think it's just like this huge aha moment for the intern where they're like, I want to teach object-based. And it's like, well, we're teaching in an object-based way. It's just not the way that you want to talk about it. And so getting, I think that learning about like listening can be really hard, and just pausing and really listening to, I think we've just learned a lot that before we have interns or new employees start using the VTS method, they do a lot of observing in terms of what we're doing as facilitators and then what the group is doing as well. And I think that that helps us catch really quickly, like, okay, here you have this expectation and this is actually what's happening. So I don't know if it's like failure in the sense that it just ends up making, like I said, reshaping our expectations. However, it did have negative consequences a few times with, we also train our partnering classroom teachers, and the classroom teachers are seeing okay, the intern isn't doing really well with linking comments, but that's what you ask us to do, or they're not asking for evidence from the students and you ask us to do that. So there's kind of this delicate balance of helping them like then going back to the teacher and saying, you weren't really good at this when you first started either. This is a learning opportunity for this person. So, and just why that's important for, we obviously want students and teachers to have the best experience, but also recognizing that we're here to help train the next generation or the next group. And so I think part of it is just you have this expectation of, okay, we have to do this certain type of teaching all the time, but then I think for us, like realizing that interns were struggling with it, a few interns were struggling, helped us realize that reflection needs to be more of our practice. So it seemed like something that was really uncomfortable at first, but then it's like, okay, why is this happening? And then it helped us to grow from that. So I think that's kind of a type of failure in that sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, there's also the occasion where you create a very clear list of, what something is, and, so that expectations should be, manageable, but no matter what, sometimes everybody goes into something thinking, they read it, but they don't process it. And so you can see the description, but not really understand it because you still have the model in your head of what it's going to be or should be. So that can happen too. And I had another failure in that I was trying to do a participatory activity a la Nina Simon, where we had the exhibition, The Record, Contemporary Art and Vinyl, a few years ago. And so I created some buttons that people could pick up at the entrance and wear, and then a little sheet that said, find people with buttons and here are some questions to talk about. And there were, I think, 3 different buttons, and one was like record collector and like music lover and something else. So there were kind of 3 different categories that you could identify yourself as. And people took the buttons and liked the buttons, but nobody ever actually talked to each other with them. I think it was really not clear to people that there was a connection between this little like handout right next to the buttons and that there was something to do. So it ended up kind of being, I guess, guerrilla marketing more than anything. But so just another example of either beta testing something or, being really explicit about things. I will also say that I had limitations in, how I think museum educators often want to be much more explicit and capital letters, 25-point font than the curators wanted to be. And since this was something that was available in the gallery, which is a coup in and of itself, there were compromises that had to be made. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, those lovely compromises.
Yes.
So the other one of the other sections that I wanted to point out at the towards the end of the book in terms of looking forward is Greg Stevens, who works for AAM, was talking about this notion of having a career posse. And this was really interesting. So Julene and I both we're part of the task force that's becoming a working group on behalf of NAEA with this initiative called Peer-to-Peer. And it started off with this inquiry or request from the members just to look for more opportunities for mentorship as well as ways to connect with your colleagues on a peer-to-peer level. And when we started planning that out, I think that was about 3 years ago, we started realizing initially it was a mentoring idea, but the more we started mapping it out, the more and more it came up about how you can connect and network with peers at the same level. So we came up with this idea of the Hangouts, like we're doing right now, and it started making me think a lot in terms of where do I turn personally just for mentoring, or how do you go about networking. And the idea about the career posse, I love it, is just getting meeting, whether it's virtually here over Hangout or in person on a regular basis, and just checking in with colleagues just to help you, like, can you be candid and honest and have this open forum where you can talk about things without feeling the need where you're feeling like you're going to be judged. And in Boston, there was a group of us that were all using VTS a couple years ago, and we started meeting together, and we called it carriage house meetings because they were taking place in a carriage house, and they were monthly. And initially, it was just a way for us to connect and say, okay, what are we all doing with this particular methodology, and what can we learn from each other? So I know at the beginning, a couple of us were starting middle school programs. Some of us were starting to think about different ways of researching. Those conversations actually led us to form a Boston VTS consortium, where we then pooled resources and created whole new programming together. And that has since kind of tapered off. So I just love this group because it ebbs and flows. But even now, I still think of those 12 or 15 colleagues as the Carriage House group. And I know that if I have a question about something, I can usually fire off an email or ask to meet over a coffee. So it tends to be more in smaller groups right now, just for various reasons. But I really liked that sense of community, and it was just this great way to really think outside the box in terms of, here we're going to try applying VTS to a room. What do you guys think about this? Here are some things that happened. Or what do you think about this image pairing? Or we're thinking about adding a component where we ask students to go and work in small groups and research certain things. Let's talk out what that looks like. Or towards the end, it was, we have new leadership in our museum and they're not really into this type of teaching. Are there certain ways that I can advocate for it in certain ways? So it was really helpful in that way. But then the last part, the other way that helps is I think NAEA is a great resource for peers just through Hangouts, but then also just in turning and talking to your colleagues when you go to convention. And I know that as a presenter, and I'm sure Julene has had this experience as well, so I've presented a lot in terms of school and teacher programs, and you learn really quickly who is doing similar work in terms of audience, but then you also learn really quickly who are the folks that have been in the game or in the field for a very long time, who's in it the same as you, and then who's coming up. And through that, just going up and talking to colleagues and maintaining those connections, so one of those has led to a great connection with someone in LA, and we've been talking about applying for a major grant together and thinking about how we can learn from each other in a more formalized way as well. But also, the colleague called me practically in tears when something didn't work really well, and we kind of problem solved together about how she could present the workshop in a different way the next day. So just having that peer network and just that support group, because you could go home and talk to your partner or your spouse or another friend, but they might not understand what you're going through, particularly if they're not in the same field. So just having that museum education support network is really helpful. So I'm sure you have some ideas about that too, Julene.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I love about the field too, is that we're so open and collaborative and sharing. I feel like nobody's proprietary, or I've run into very few people who are proprietary about their ideas. It's like, yeah, I did this. You shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. Here, take it. So I always feel comfortable reaching out to colleagues who I don't know in person, but it's like, oh, well, there's Museum X and there's a museum educator there. Sure, I feel comfortable calling them up or sending them an email, even if I don't have a personal relationship with them, because I think in general this is a really warm and sharing field. And so for folks who are new or a little shy, please keep that in mind. And I think 99.9% of us are happy to talk and, and share it and all that good stuff. And that brings up that idea of networking, and I guess tying a little bit back to what I was saying before of, networking is such a nebulous thing. It's really important, but what does it really look like besides talking to somebody at a cocktail party or a reception or before or after a lecture? I don't really know. All of that counts, but also, posting on Museum Ed listserv counts as networking. You're putting your ideas out there and asking for help, and people share all the time. I realize that there's benefits. Growing up, I did not enjoy my very unusual name, but now when I post things on Museum Ed listserv, people are like, oh yeah, I know your name, you've asked that question or whatever. Or a few years I I actually posted exactly that story that I told about the docent self-evaluation and how badly that went. And it was a really long post, but I was like, hey, look what I did, and it was awful. And I got so many positive responses from that saying, wow, thank you so much for sharing that and being candid and whatnot. um, and again, maybe it's just my personality, but yeah, here's what I learned. And um, you know, you don't make the same mistake that I did. So keeping that in mind, and I think that's part of the networking that sometimes we forget about, is like we want to network so that we can help our own careers and help ourselves and learn more and professionally develop ourselves, but it should also be a two-way street, right? The person you're connecting with should also get something out of that interaction, whether it's just knowing somebody in a new city or having a connection in a museum that they didn't before. um, there should always be some kind of back and forth. So keeping that in mind, when you're talking to somebody at a conference, oh, this is this thing that I'm really interested in and I've read a whole lot about, and I'd love to talk to you about that if you have any ideas, so that you've got this knowledge base about this thing that you can share with somebody else is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think going along with that idea of networking also, and developing your own career, like what connections or networks can you make outside of museum education world too? For example, I think, I'm trying to remember how we first connected, but my colleague Sarah and I were talking to someone from Harvard, from the Arts and Education program, who is in the cognition, and brain track. So just thinking about, in neuroscience. So we met and talked, for a while about our school partnership program, and through the conversation, it came up that her father actually was a teacher in one of our programs. So, and just there was that weird connection. But then she recommended all of these amazing books, and shared some of her research papers that she had done throughout the program, and it was really helpful just in terms of giving us an entry point and thinking about cognition, brain, neuroscience, and how that might connect with what we're trying to do, or how it might not. And it's been great because since then, I think she's still kind of, thinking about what her career move will be, and we've been keeping in touch. And along the way, it's like, oh, I found this article. Did you see this? So it's just, and we do that back and forth. So that's really helpful. And then also, um, thinking a lot about networking, or how you connect with different audiences. And I think that when I first entered the field, and I've primarily worked in school and teacher programs throughout my career, there was a lot of emphasis on, okay, we have to get ready, let's create these different materials, or start the framework for the program. And I think, especially since I worked at the Gardner, it's really been interesting in terms of how you can build those relationships and the networks with the teachers that you work with and administrators, which then lead to other connections and just better understanding what that audience is going through. And I know a lot of states are grappling with, updated learning standards, whether through the Common Core state standards, or I know new visual art standards are rolling out, and just understanding teachers and how they're approaching that, or what they're grappling with. And so especially when things don't work well. So if we're mapping out something for teachers and I'm realizing that, I don't know, like usually we'll get 15 or 20 people to come and I have like 3 RSVPs, it's just, then it's like, something's going on, whether the program isn't meeting their needs, or meeting their expectations or interests, or they're all stressed out because the new evaluation, process is rolling out and they have to fill out a ton of paperwork that same week. So interesting things like that. And I think that's been helpful just, in terms of shaping, particularly the type of teaching, or just how we approach communication with teachers. I found myself becoming less formal and becoming more informal and more conversational over time, and that's just been tremendous in terms of opening doors. So not just networking, amongst our peers, but then also thinking about, within museum education, but peers in other fields too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of talking and listening to teachers, I think, is extremely helpful and enlightening. I mean, I remember, when I was first in the field thinking, well, why aren't the teachers coming? And oh my gosh, and they're not organized. And the more you talk to teachers, you realize, what a hassle it is to try and get a field trip. If it's the art teacher, some of them aren't even allowed to request a field trip. I mean, you just, it's so hard when you're right out of grad school and you think you know everything because you have this shiny degree. But listen to those teachers and you will find out how much work they are doing and how what a Herculean effort it is for them to come to your museum, even if it's free, even if you've paid for the bus and the field trip is free. Like, it is still way hard to get all of that happening. I also wanted to, there's a couple of things I'm going to say them out loud before I forget, is
Okay.
you and I should explain just briefly what our backgrounds are so that people know where we're coming from
Mm-hmm.
and how long we've been in the field, et cetera, and how we got to where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is thinking, I think that point of connecting with people outside the museum is really important. Connecting with people at universities can be really exciting, and I'm really lucky to work at a university, but also when you're talking about working in living and working in Boston, you've got so many museums and things to take advantage of. You know, there's so many little tiny museums out there where you don't have that great network. And so hopefully something like peer-to-peer and Hangouts is helping with that. But trying to really think creatively about what other creative or collaborative communities could be out there. You know, maybe it's looking for the dance teachers and the music teachers in the area who teach after school lessons, and maybe you get together with them and brainstorm things there. I think there's lots to be taken from so many different fields. We had somebody who's just starting at Bank Street now. He was working on a grant program that we had, and he has a background in music composition and performance, and that manifested itself in so many exciting ways in the program and all the things that he did. So really, really great. Briefly, my background is I have been in the field for around more than 10 years, definitely more than 10 years. I don't know, I have to do the math. But I have a undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia in art history and French. And right after college, I went and got a full-time internship at the Bruce Museum of Arts and Science in Greenwich, Connecticut. And they had a paid internship, not very much, none of those full-time entry-level internships pay very much, but it was an opportunity to work in 3 different departments of a small museum, and that was really helpful to figure out, to kind of cross things off my list. I was pretty sure I wanted to go into museum education, but I tried PR, I tried collections management, and I tried curatorial, and I realized that I never ever want to do PR. And you know, yes, education was a good fit. I went to graduate school, the Arts and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and right after that did another fellowship at the De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and then ended up going back to the Bruce Museum. A job opened up there, so I did outreach education. We had the Bruce Mobile, got to drive a van with dinosaurs on the outside. It was
Awesome.
awesome.
Yep.
taking my sea stars and live moon snails out to classrooms everywhere. So that, and then the position opened up at the Nasher Museum. We opened to the public in 2005, and I started as curator of education just a few months before that grand opening. So I've been at the Nasher for 9 years, which is the longest I've been at any place. And some days it feels like 2 seconds, and some days it feels like 20 years. But the more I can't remember what exhibition was when, I realize it's been 9 years. So.
And that's okay.
It's okay.
That's interesting because I've been at the Gardner for 9 years, so that's good. See, peer to peer connecting.
That's right.
We have a lot in common right there.
And I think we're both Gen Xers, right?
Yes.
I'm 37, so
yes, I'm 36.
Okay, so yeah, we're more likely to be stable, or not stable, that's the wrong word, but stay in one job for longer than our younger colleagues.
Yep. Yeah. Great. So, and I could just really briefly, I went, so similar, I went from a studio BFA undergraduate program and wanting and liking to paint for 10 hours a day to then looking to, I actually originally was looking to go into MFA programs for painting, and I did not get into any, but I also applied to the arts administration program at Boston University, and then I also applied for art and design education at the Rhode Island School of Design. And when I visited both, I actually really liked both programs, but RISD stood out to me because I remember meeting David Henry, who was then curator of education at the RISD Museum, and he asked, like, why are you interested in museum education? And I was saying that as an artist, I had this frustration of going to art museums and going with friends or going with family or colleagues and not having a shared understanding or shared vocabulary in terms of how we looked at and talked about art, particularly modern and contemporary art, which I really personally love and connect with on many levels. And I remember just that feeling of inadequacy and knowing that there had to be a way of not that I want everybody to love and engage with art in the same way as me, but just really, how could we at least have a civil conversation while we're looking at, even if we're disagreeing, looking at different types of art? And David said, okay, well, this would be a great program for you because we will help you learn about the different facets of art museum education, but also I think you'll find that you'll be able to learn techniques where you can talk to any audience. And I was like, this is fantastic. So so I did the RISD program, and through that, it was a 2-year program at the time, and I wrote a thesis about actually how art museums engage adults and looking at different examples of how museums were using, at the time, printed guides or materials to engage with adults, and noticing that most of those materials at the times were approaching adult visitors as folks who understood quite a bit about art history or context, and knowing that I knew that wasn't true for everyone who walked in the doors just from my personal experience. And that's where I first stumbled on Abigail Housen's theory of aesthetic development, and seeing that that's okay, regardless of where you are, there are ways that you can connect with works of art. And that then led me to Philip Yenowin's work at MoMA and just digging in deeper about how do you actually engage visitors who have no experience or little but want to engage. And so I wrote my dissertation, and then I started at the Addison Gallery of American Art through an education fellowship, where I literally was thrown to the wolves, and I think I had to start teaching within a month after I started there, and learned really quickly how to pronounce artist names or how not to pronounce them, how to design programs for teachers in schools and working with teens. And then I then went to Montclair Art Museum in New Jersey, and worked with docents for the first time and learned a lot of things along the way, and they were very patient. I think we both had a lot of patience for learning about each other, but just how you go about training others in working with or teaching different groups of different visitors. And then that led me to the Gardner position. I've been there for 9 years, and I was really drawn to the Gardner because of the emphasis on research as well as teaching, and thinking about how those things can go hand in hand with theory, so research, theory, and practice, and just being really reflective. And so I think I just really like the chance to geek out, which I still do every day. I can do a lot of research, and I'm really just enjoying that, like learning more about how students, and especially right now, thinking about how teachers can really grow and learn a lot from their own experiences with art, and then also thinking about how they can engage their own students. So, but I mean, I did not have a lick of understanding of education before I went into the field. So there was, like I said, like it doesn't necessarily, you don't have to have that experience before you join the field, but I think you definitely have to have an open mind and understanding that you're going to learn a lot along the way, and you're probably going to stumble and fall on your face quite a bit along the way, but you need to keep going, and how can you persevere through a lot of that. So it's interesting. I mean, and that's the great thing. You know, I feel like I've been saying this a lot lately, but it's the great strength and also real drawback, I think, of our field, where there is no one path. There are many different particularly now, a lot of graduate programs about museum studies or museum education, but you don't have to do that pathway. A lot of people in art museums come from a studio background or art history as well. I think a lot of folks that are interested in management typically have some type of graduate degree, just so you have that grounding in theory and program design, but it makes it really interesting, and you end up having really different ways of thinking. But I think sometimes it also divides us because we have different backgrounds or because we have different ways of thinking about things. So it's kind of like this push and pull of what we do.
And that makes me want to ask the eternal question. First, I want to share an anecdote, but I'll ask the question so I don't forget the question. But what do you think about museum studies programs as graduate programs? Are they useful? Are they not? I don't know enough about them. I just know when I was going into the field that, and the advice that I still give interns, and I hope it's the right advice, is that if I'm looking to hire somebody, I want to know that they can teach. So I'd rather have that education background, whether it's museum education or etc. Museum studies to me sound so general and broad that you get the idea of how a museum works, but it can't possibly have been focused enough that you really are in depth into a certain area. And before I let you answer, I have to just share that I think I also was destined to work in museum education. I just didn't know it because my mom became a docent at the UVA Art Museum when I was 5. When I went into kindergarten, she was able to do that. And she had an incredibly progressive director of education at that time who was using inquiry. And so so that was more than 30 years ago. It was not the norm to be using inquiry in tours. And that's what she learned. And so I just went into the field thinking, well, duh, everybody does this, and realizing, oh no, it's not. And our little town had a great director of education, and so totally skewed my perspective. But yeah, I couldn't avoid it.
No, it's a good question. So my personal experience with most of the colleagues that I know in museums that have museum studies degrees are actually not educators. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that for museum education, but and I know Ben Garcia has an article in the or chapter in the book that talks about, yes, you should go to grad school, but I think that a lot of the museum studies folks that I know are in collections management or registrars or do something with curatorial. And I think, like you said, I think a lot of that is because they have a broader lens just in terms of how museums work in general. And then as, through internships or as they get a little bit more experience, they then kind of choose their pathway through that. I do know some folks that have done museum studies and then have an emphasis on education, so that has led to things as well. Like I know Tufts University has a program like that. So I think, though, it sounds like when we both thought about where we wanted to go to school, we thought a lot about like our goals or what we wanted to get out of it or what we knew we were lacking and needed to learn a little bit more. So if you're really curious about museums and how they work, and you think you might want to go into higher management at some point, I could see like a museum studies degree helping you, and just in terms of understanding the different departments. But if you're interested in education and you don't have that education background, I tend to encourage students to think about an art education or museum education program, just so that they have that grounding in theory. Because, like you said, like a lot of I feel like discussions or inquiry-based is very commonly used, for example, as teaching practices now, but it might not have been the case like 10 years ago. And so sometimes when you enter into internships, there's an assumption that the intern knows certain things, or this is just the culture of our department. And I think that if you have that education background, then you have at least something to fall back on, or at least a starting point, so that you're not starting kind of at ground zero. That being said, I'm sure if you have the right disposition and interest, I'm sure you can make it work too. So it is interesting too, because I only know a handful of folks in the field that have Ph.D.s, and I'm always interested to see like who has a Ph.D. and what they do with it. Like I know Mike Morawski, who's the director of education at the Portland Art Museum, has a I think he might have an EDD. But just thinking about like what would that what your interests are and how you might use it. I'm not sure if Mike knew that he wanted to go into museum education when he earned that degree either. So it's
yeah, and I know Mark Osterman at Viscaya,
yes.
if I'm pronouncing that right. He's working on his Ph.D. right now, so
yes.
to be working full time and doing that sounds exhausting.
Yes, yes, and our colleague Christine Healy at the Heidi Museum of Modern Art in Melbourne, Australia, is also working on her PhD. So, and I know she's working, and it's a long process. So kudos to all of our colleagues that work on degrees while they're working. But if you I don't know, like you said, like if there's something like you're really curious and you're really passionate and you want to learn more, then like I think there's nothing wrong with. I highly encourage going to graduate school. It seems like more and more people in the field are getting graduate degrees or entering the field with graduate degrees. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes the field of museum education over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Should we wrap up?
Yeah, I was just thinking about wrap up. Yeah, I'm sure Julian and I could keep talking about this for hours. I'm sure more of you could also join us. We did have some technical difficulties with our Q&A app, so if you have a question or a comment or you'd like to share insights from your own experience, please feel free to type that into the comments box on this page. If you're someone entering the field, I hope this was helpful. If you're in the field, hopefully you got some nice insights as well. But I think it's a great idea to pause and take some time and prioritize having, even if just for an hour a week, some time to read an article or a book. And this Hangout series, I think, has been helpful this summer just for me in getting back into that practice. So thank you, Julian, for coming up with that idea. And thank you again, Emily Holtrup, for the idea. And I hope that it'll be interesting to see what that looks like over time as well.
Will you plug the next one too?
Yes. So the next one, I have the book right here. So the next Hangout is about creativity in museum practice, which is co-written by Linda Norris and Rainey Tisdale. And one or both of the authors will be joining us for that Hangout, which Julene will be moderating. So this book, I feel like has been it's just hot and everywhere in the field right now, this idea of creativity. There have been a lot of workshops around this book, and it seems to really be getting a lot of us noodling into our work and thinking about it from new perspectives. So we're excited about that. That Hangout will take place in October.
And it's a great fast read. So
yes.
And you can dip in and dip out really easily, so you don't have to sit down for hours and concentrate on it. You can pick it up and flip through it. So I highly recommend.
Absolutely. And I know kind of related to this book, the most recent edition of the Journal of Museum Education also deals with creativity, and I know educators from Columbus, Ohio, co-edited that issue. So there's, like I said, creativity is kind of a buzzword right now in museum education, so we're excited about that. So stay tuned. There will be information on our Google Plus page about that. And thank you again for joining us, for watching this Hangout. We hope that that you had some fun along the way. And thank you, Julene, for joining me, and Tracy, who's watching along. And we'll hope to see you soon in the next Hangout. So take care, everyone.
Bye.